Chapter 30. Terrific Saurian Combat. Saturday, August 15th. The sea still retains its uniform monotony. The same leaden hue, the same eternal glare from above. No indication of land being in sight. The horizon appears to retreat before us, more and more as we advance. My head, still dull and heavy from the effects of my extraordinary dream, which I cannot as yet banish from my mind. The professor, who has not dreamed, is, however, in one of his morose and unaccountable humors. Spends his time in scanning the horizon, at every point of the compass. His telescope is raised every moment to his eyes, and when he finds nothing to give any clue to our whereabouts, he assumes a Napoleonic attitude and walks anxiously. I remarked that my uncle, the professor, had a strong tendency to resume his old impatient character, and I could not but make a note of this disagreeable circumstance in my journal. I saw clearly that it had required all the influence of my danger and suffering to extract from him one scintillation of humane feeling. Now that I was quite recovered, his original nature had conquered and obtained the upper hand. And after all, what had he to be angry and annoyed about, now more than at any other time? Was not the journey being accomplished under the most favorable circumstances? Was not the raft progressing with the most marvelous rapidity? What then could be the matter? After one or two preliminary hems, I determined to inquire. "You seem uneasy, uncle," said I, when for about the 100th time he put down his telescope and walked up and down, muttering to himself. "No, I am not uneasy," he replied in a dry, harsh tone, "by no means." "Perhaps I should have said impatient," I replied, softening the force of my remark. "Enough to make me so, I think." "And yet we are advancing at a rate seldom attained by a raft," I remarked. "What matters that?" cried my uncle. "I am not vexed at the rate we go at, but I am annoyed to find the sea so much vaster than I expected." I then recollected that the professor, before our departure, had estimated the length of this subterranean ocean as at most about 30 leagues. Now we had traveled at least over thrice that distance without discovering any trace of the distant shore. I began to understand my uncle's anger. "We are not going down," suddenly exclaimed the professor. "We are not progressing with our great discoveries. All this is utter loss of time. After all, I did not come from home to undertake a party of pleasure. This voyage on a raft over a pond annoys and wearies me." He called this adventurous journey a party of pleasure, and this great inland sea a pond. "But," argued I, "if we have followed the route indicated by the great Saknussemm, we cannot be going far wrong. That is the question, as the great, the immortal Shakespeare has it. Are we following the route indicated by that wondrous sage? Did Saknussemm ever fall in with this great sheet of water? If he did he cross it? I begin to fear that the rivulet we adopted for a guide has led us wrong. In any case, we can never regret having come thus far. It is worth the whole journey to have enjoyed this magnificent spectacle. It is something to have seen. I care nothing about seeing, nor about magnificent spectacles. I came down into the interior of the earth with an object, and that object I mean to attain. Don't talk to me about admiring scenery or any other sentimental trash." After this, I thought it well to hold my tongue and allow the professor to bite his lips until the blood came, without further remark. At 6 o'clock in the evening, our matter-of-fact guide, Hans, asked for his week's salary, and receiving his 3 Rixdollars, put them carefully in his pocket. He was perfectly contented and satisfied. Sunday, August 16th. Nothing new to record. The same weather as before. The wind has a slight tendency to freshen up, with signs of an approaching gale. When I awoke, my first observation was in regard to the intensity of the light. I keep on fearing, day after day, that the extraordinary electric phenomenon should become first obscured, and then go wholly out, leaving us in total darkness. Nothing, however, of the kind occurs. The shadow of the raft, its mast and sails, is clearly distinguished on the surface of the water. This wondrous sea is, after all, infinite in its extent. It must be quite as wide as the Mediterranean or, perhaps, even as the great Atlantic Ocean. Why, after all, should it not be so? My uncle has on more than one occasion tried deep-sea soundings. He tied the cross of one of our heaviest crowbars to the extremity of a cord, which he allowed to run out to the extent of 200 fathoms. We had the greatest difficulty in hoisting in our novel kind of lead. When the crowbar was finally dragged on board, Hans called my attention to some singular marks upon its surface. The piece of iron looked as if it had been crushed between two very hard substances. I looked at our worthy guide with an inquiring glance. "Tander," said he. Of course I was at a loss to understand. I turned round towards my uncle, absorbed in gloomy reflections. I had little wish to disturb him from his reverie. I accordingly turned once more towards our worthy Icelander. Hans very quietly and significantly opened his mouth once or twice, as if in the act of biting, and in this way made me understand his meaning. "Teeth," cried I with stupefaction, as I examined the bar of iron with more attention. "Yes, there can be no doubt about the matter. The indentations on the bar of iron are the marks of teeth. What jaws must the owner of such molars be possessed of? Have we then come upon a monster of unknown species, which still exists within the vast waste of waters, a monster more voracious than a shark, more terrible and bulky than the whale? I am unable to withdraw my eyes from the bar of iron, actually half crushed. Is then my dream about to come true, a dread and terrible reality? All day my thoughts were bent upon these speculations, and my imagination scarcely regained a degree of calmness and power of reflection until after a sleep of many hours. This day, as on other Sundays, we observed as a day of rest and pious meditation. Monday, August 17th. I have been trying to realize from memory the particular instincts of those antediluvian animals of the secondary period, which succeeding to the mollusca, to the crustacea, and to the fish, preceded the appearance of the race of mammifers. The generation of reptiles then reigned supreme upon the earth. These hideous monsters ruled everything in the seas of the secondary period, which formed the strata of which the Jura Mountains are composed. Nature had endowed them with perfect organization. What a gigantic structure was theirs, what vast and prodigious strength they possessed. The existing saurians, which include all such reptiles as lizards, crocodiles, and alligators, even the largest and most formidable of their class, are but feeble imitations of their mighty sires, the animals of ages long ago. If there were giants in the days of old, there were also gigantic animals. I shuddered as I evolved from my mind the idea and recollection of these awful monsters. No eye of man had seen them in the flesh. They took their walks abroad upon the face of the earth thousands of ages before man came into existence, and their fossil bones, discovered in the limestone, have allowed us to reconstruct them anatomically, and thus to get some faint idea of their colossal formation. I recollect once seeing in the Great Museum of Hamburg the skeleton of one of these wonderful saurians. It measured no less than 30 feet from the nose to the tail. Am I, then, an inhabitant of the earth of the present day, destined to find myself face to face with a representative of this antediluvian family? I can scarcely believe it possible, I can hardly believe it true. And yet these marks of powerful teeth upon the bar of iron. Can there be a doubt from their shape that the bite is the bite of a crocodile? My eyes stare wildly and with terror upon the subterranean sea. Every moment I expect one of these monsters to rise from its vast cavernous depths. I fancy that the worthy professor in some measure shares my notions, if not my fears, for, after an attentive examination of the crowbar, he cast his eyes rapidly over the mighty and mysterious ocean. What could possess him to leave the land, I thought, as if the depth of this water was of any importance to us? No doubt he has disturbed some terrible monster in his watery home, and perhaps we may pay dearly for our temerity. Anxious to be prepared for the worst, I examined our weapons and saw that they were in a fit state for use. My uncle looked on at me and nodded his head approvingly. He, too, has noticed what we have to fear. Already the uplifting of the waters on the surface indicates that something is in motion below. The danger approaches. It comes nearer and nearer. It behooves us to be on the watch. Tuesday, August 18th. Evening came at last, the hour when the desire for sleep caused our eyelids to be heavy. Night there is not, properly speaking, in this place, any more than there is in summer in the Arctic regions. Hans, however, is immovable at the rudder. When he snatches a moment of rest, I really cannot say. I take advantage of his vigilance to take some little repose. But 2 hours after I was awakened from a heavy sleep by an awful shock. The raft appeared to have struck upon a sunken rock. It was lifted right out of the water by some wondrous and mysterious power, and then started off 20 fathoms distant. What is it?" cried my uncle, starting up. "Are we shipwrecked or what?" Hans raised his hand and pointed to where, about 200 yards off, a large black mass was moving up and down. I looked with awe. My worst fears were realized. "It is a colossal monster," I cried, clasping my hands. "Yes," cried the agitated professor, "and there yonder is a huge sea lizard of terrible size and shape. And farther on behold a prodigious crocodile. Look at his hideous jaws, and that row of monstrous teeth. Huh? He has gone. A whale." "A whale," shouted the professor. "I can see her enormous fins. See how she blows air and water." 2 liquid columns rose to a vast height above the level of the sea, into which they fell with a terrific crash, waking up the echoes of that awful place. We stood still, surprised, stupefied, terror-stricken at the sight of this group of fearful marine monsters, more hideous in the reality than in my dream. They were of supernatural dimensions. The very smallest of the whole party could with ease have crushed our raft and ourselves with a single bite. Hans, seizing the rudder which had flown out of his hand, puts it hard other in order to escape from such dangerous vicinity. But no sooner does he do so than he finds he is flying from Scylla to Charybdis. To leeward is a turtle about 40 feet wide, and a serpent quite as long, with an enormous and hideous head peering from out the waters. Look which way we will, it is impossible for us to fly. The fearful reptiles advanced upon us. They turned and twisted about the raft with awful rapidity. They formed around our devoted vessel a series of concentric circles. I took up my rifle in desperation. But what effect can a rifle ball produce upon the armor scales with which the bodies of these horrid monsters are covered? We remain still and dumb from utter horror. They advance upon us, nearer and nearer. Our fate appears certain, fearful and terrible. On one side the mighty crocodile, on the other the great sea serpent. The rest of the fearful crowd of marine prodigies have plunged beneath the briny waves and disappeared. I am about to fire at any risk and try the effect of a shot. Hans, the guide, however, interfered by a sign to check me. The 2 hideous and ravenous monsters passed within 50 fathoms of the raft, and then made a rush at one another, their fury and rage preventing them from seeing us. The combat commenced. We distinctly made out every action of the 2 hideous monsters. But to my excited imagination, the other animals appeared about to take part in the fierce and deadly struggle. The monster, the whale, the lizard, and the turtle. I distinctly saw them every moment. I pointed them out to the Icelander. But he only shook his head. "TVA," he said. "What to only does he say?" "Surely he is mistaken," I cried in a tone of wonder. "He is quite right," replied my uncle coolly and philosophically, examining the terrible duel with his telescope and speaking as if he were in a lecture room. "How can that be?" "Yes, it is so. The first of these hideous monsters has the snout of a porpoise, the head of a lizard, the teeth of a crocodile, and it is this that has deceived us. It is the most fearful of all antediluvian reptiles, the world-renowned ichthyosaurus or great fish lizard. And the other? The other is a monstrous serpent, concealed under the hard vaulted shell of the turtle, the terrible enemy of its fearful rival, the plesiosaurus or sea crocodile." Hans was quite right. The 2 monsters only disturbed the surface of the sea. At last have mortal eyes gazed upon 2 reptiles of the great primitive ocean. I see the flaming red eyes of the ichthyosaurus, each as big or bigger than a man's head. Nature, in its infinite wisdom, had gifted this wondrous marine animal with an optical apparatus of extreme power, capable of resisting the pressure of the heavy layers of water, which rolled over him in the depths of the ocean, where he usually fed. It has by some authors truly been called the whale of the saurian race, for it is as big and quick in its motions as our king of the seas. This one measures not less than 100 feet in length, and I can form some idea of his girth when I see him lift his prodigious tail out of the waters. His jaw is of awful size and strength, and according to the best-informed naturalists, it does not contain less than 182 teeth. The other was the mighty plesiosaurus, a serpent with a cylindrical trunk, with a short stumpy tail, with fins like a bank of oars in a Roman galley. Its whole body covered by a carapace or shell, and its neck, as flexible as that of a swan, rose more than 30 feet above the waves, a tower of animated flesh. These animals attacked one another with inconceivable fury. Such a combat was never seen before by mortal eyes, and to us who did see it, it appeared more like the phantasmagoric creation of a dream than anything else. They raised mountains of water, which dashed in spray over the raft, already tossed to and fro by the waves. 20 times we seemed on the point of being upset and hurled headlong into the waves. Hideous hisses appeared to shake the gloomy granite roof of that mighty cavern, hisses which carried terror to our hearts. The awful combatants held each other in a tight embrace. I could not make out one from the other. Still the combat could not last forever, and woe unto us, whichsoever became the victor. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours passed away, without any decisive result. The struggle continued with the same deadly tenacity, but without apparent result. The deadly opponents now approached, now drew away from the raft. Once or twice we fancied they were about to leave us altogether, but instead of that, they came nearer and nearer. We crouched on the raft ready to fire at them at a moment's notice, poor as the prospect of hurting or terrifying them was. Still we were determined not to perish without a struggle. Suddenly, the ichthyosaurus and the plesiosaurus disappeared beneath the waves, leaving behind them a maelstrom in the midst of the sea. We were nearly drawn down by the indraft of the water. Several minutes elapsed before anything was again seen. Was this wonderful combat to end in the depths of the ocean? Was the last act of this terrible drama to take place without spectators? It was impossible for us to say. Suddenly, at no great distance from us, an enormous mass rises out of the waters the head of the great plesiosaurus. The terrible monster is now wounded unto death. I can see nothing now of his enormous body. All that could be distinguished was his serpent-like neck, which he twisted and curled in all the agonies of death. Now he struck the waters with it as if it had been a gigantic whip, and then again wriggled like a worm cut in two. The water was spurted up to a great distance in all directions. A great portion of it swept over our raft and nearly blinded us. But soon the end of the beast approached nearer and nearer. His movements slackened visibly, his contortions almost ceased, and at last the body of the mighty snake lay an inert, dead mass on the surface of the now calm and placid waters. As for the ichthyosaurus, has he gone down to his mighty cavern under the sea to rest, or will he reappear to destroy us? This question remained unanswered, and we had breathing time. Chapter 31. The Sea Monster. Wednesday, August 19th. Fortunately, the wind, which for the present blows with some violence, has allowed us to escape from the scene of the unparalleled and extraordinary struggle. Hans, with his usual imperturbable calm, remained at the helm. My uncle, who for a short time had been withdrawn from his absorbing reveries by the novel incidents of this sea fight, fell back again apparently into a brown study. His eyes were fixed impatiently on the widespread ocean. Our voyage now became monotonous and uniform. Dull as it has become, I have no desire to have it broken by any repetition of the perils and adventures of yesterday. Thursday, August 20th. The wind is now N, and blows very irregularly. It has changed to fitful gusts. The temperature is exceedingly high. We are now progressing at the average rate of about 10 miles and a half per hour. About 12 o'clock, a distant sound, as if thunder, fell upon our ears. I make a note of the fact without even venturing a suggestion as to its cause. It was one continued roar, as of a sea falling over mighty rocks. Far off in the distance, said the professor dogmatically, there is some rock or some island against which the sea, lashed to fury by the wind, is breaking violently. Hans, without saying a word, clambered to the top of the mast, but could make out nothing. The ocean was level, in every direction as far as the eye could reach. 3 hours passed away without any sign to indicate what might be before us. The sound began to assume that of a mighty cataract. I expressed my opinion on this point strongly to my uncle. He merely shook his head. I, however, am strongly impressed by a conviction that I am not wrong. Are we advancing towards some mighty waterfall which shall cast us into the abyss? Probably this mode of descending into the abyss may be agreeable to the professor, because it would be something like the vertical descent he is so eager to make. I entertain a very different opinion. Whatever be the truth, it is certain that not many leagues distant there must be some very extraordinary phenomenon, for as we advance the roar becomes something mighty and stupendous. Is it in the water or in the air? I cast hasty glances aloft at the suspended vapors, and I seek to penetrate their mighty depths. But the vault above is tranquil. The clouds, which are now elevated to the very summit, appear utterly still and motionless, and completely lost in the irradiation of electric light. It is necessary, therefore, to seek for the cause of this phenomenon elsewhere. I examine the horizon, now perfectly calm, pure, and free from all haze. Its aspect still remains unchanged. But if this awful noise proceeds from a cataract, if, so to speak in plain English, this vast interior ocean is precipitated into a lower basin, if these tremendous roars are produced by the noise of falling waters, the current would increase in activity, and its increasing swiftness would give me some idea of the extent of the peril with which we are menaced. I consult the current. It simply does not exist. There is no such thing. An empty bottle cast into the water lies to leeward without motion. About 4 o'clock Hans rises, clambers up the mast, and reaches the truck itself. From this elevated position, his looks are cast around. They take in a vast circumference of the ocean. At last, his eyes remain fixed. His face expresses no astonishment, but his eyes slightly dilate. "He has seen something at last," cried my uncle. "I think so," I replied. Hans came down, stood beside us, and pointed with his right hand to the south. "Dare near," he said. "There," replied my uncle. And seizing his telescope, he looked at it with great attention for about a minute, which to me appeared an age. I knew not what to think or expect. "Yes, yes," he cried in a tone of considerable surprise, "there it is." "What?" I asked. "A tremendous spurt of water rising out of the waves." "Some other marine monster," I cried, already alarmed. "Perhaps." "Then let us steer more to the westward, for we know what we have to expect from antediluvian animals," was my eager reply. "Go ahead," said my uncle. I turned towards Hans. Hans was at the tiller, steering with his usual imperturbable calm. Nevertheless, if from the distance which separated us from this creature, a distance which must be estimated at not less than a dozen leagues, one could see the column of water spurting from the blowhole of the great animal, his dimensions must be something preternatural. To fly is, therefore, the course to be suggested by ordinary prudence. But we have not come into that part of the world to be prudent. Such is my uncle's determination. We, accordingly, continued to advance. The nearer we come, the loftier is the spouting water. What monster can fill himself with such huge volumes of water, and then unceasingly spout them out in such lofty jets? At 8 o'clock in the evening, reckoning as above ground, where there is day and night, we are not more than 2 leagues from the mighty beast. Its long, black, enormous mountainous body lies on the top of the water like an island. But then sailors have been said to have gone ashore on sleeping whales, mistaking them for land. Is it illusion or is it fear? Its length cannot be less than 1,000 fathoms. What then is this cetaceous monster of which no covier ever thought? It is quite motionless and presents the appearance of sleep. The sea seems unable to lift him upwards. It is rather the waves which break on his huge and gigantic frame. The waterspout, rising to a height of 500 feet, breaks in spray with a dull, sullen roar. We advance like senseless lunatics towards this mighty mass. I honestly confess that I was abjectly afraid. I declared that I would go no farther. I threatened in my terror to cut the sheet of the sail. It attacked the professor with considerable acrimony, calling him foolhardy, mad, I know not what. He made no answer. Suddenly, the imperturbable Hans once more pointed his finger to the menacing object. I home/I. An island, cried my uncle. An island, I replied, shrugging my shoulders at this poor attempt at deception. Of course it is, cried my uncle, bursting into a loud and joyous laugh. But the waterspout. Geyser, said Hans. Yes, of course a geyser, replied my uncle, still laughing, a geyser like those common in Iceland. Jets like this are the great wonders of the country. At first I would not allow that I had been so grossly deceived. What could be more ridiculous than to have taken an island for a marine monster? But kick as one may, one must yield to evidence, and I was finally convinced of my error. It was nothing, after all, but a natural phenomenon. As we approached nearer and nearer, the dimensions of the liquid sheaf of waters became truly grand and stupendous. The island had, at a distance, presented the appearance of an enormous whale, whose head rose high above the waters. The geyser, a word the Icelanders pronounce jæsir, and which signifies fury, rose majestically from its summit. Dull detonations are heard every now and then, and the enormous jet, taken as it were with sudden fury, shakes its plume of vapor and bounds into the first layer of the clouds. It is alone. Neither spurts of vapor nor hot springs surround it, and the whole volcanic power of that region is concentrated in one sublime column. The rays of electric light mix with this dazzling sheaf, every drop as it falls assuming the prismatic colors of the rainbow. Let us go on shore, said the professor, after some minutes of silence. It is necessary, however, to take great precaution, in order to avoid the weight of falling waters, which would cause the raft to founder in an instant. Hans, however, steers admirably, and brings us to the other extremity of the island. I was the first to leap on the rock. My uncle followed, while the eiderduck hunter remained still, like a man above any childish sources of astonishment. We were now walking on granite mixed with siliceous sandstone. The soil shivered under our feet like the sides of boilers, in which overheated steam is forcibly confined. It is burning. We soon came in sight of the little central basin from which rose the geyser. Plunged a thermometer into the water which ran bubbling from the center, and it marked a heat of 163 degrees. This water, therefore, came from some place where the heat was intense. This was singularly in contradiction with the theories of Professor Hardwigg. I could not help telling him my opinion on the subject. Well, said he sharply, and what does this prove against my doctrine? Nothing, replied I dryly, seeing that I was running my head against a foregone conclusion. Nevertheless, I am compelled to confess that, until now, we have been most remarkably fortunate, and that this voyage is being accomplished in most favorable conditions of temperature. But it appears evident, in fact, certain, that we shall sooner or later arrive at one of those regions where the central heat will reach its utmost limits and will go far beyond all the possible gradations of thermometers. Visions of the Hades of the ancients, believed to be in the center of the earth, floated through my imagination. We shall, however, see what we shall see. That is the professor's favorite phrase now. Having christened the volcanic island by the name of his nephew, the leader of the expedition turned away and gave the signal for embarkation. I stood still, however, for some minutes, gazing upon the magnificent geyser. I soon was able to perceive that the upward tendency of the water was irregular. Now it diminished in intensity, and then, suddenly, it regained new vigor, which I attributed to the variation of the pressure of the accumulated vapors in its reservoir. At last we took our departure, going carefully round the projecting, and rather dangerous, rocks of the southern side. Hans had taken advantage of this brief halt to repair the raft. Before we took our final departure from the island, however, I made some observations to calculate the distance we had gone over, and I put them down in my journal. Since we left Port Gretchen, we had traveled 270 leagues more than 800 miles on this great inland sea. We were, therefore, 620 leagues from Iceland and exactly under England. Chapter 32. The Battle of the Elements. Friday, August 21st. This morning, the magnificent geyser had wholly disappeared. The wind had freshened up, and we were fast leaving the neighborhood of Henry's Island. Even the roaring sound of the mighty column was lost to the ear. The weather, if, under the circumstances, we may use such an expression, is about to change very suddenly. The atmosphere is being gradually loaded with vapors, which carry with them the electricity formed by the constant evaporation of the saline waters. The clouds are slowly but sensibly falling towards the sea, and are assuming a dark olive texture. The electric rays can scarcely pierce through the opaque curtain which has fallen like a drop scene before this wondrous theater, on the stage of which another and terrible drama is soon to be enacted. This time it is no fight of animals, it is the fearful battle of the elements. I feel that I am very peculiarly influenced, as all creatures are on land when a deluge is about to take place. The cumuli, a perfectly oval kind of cloud, piled upon the south, presented a most awful and sinister appearance, with the pitiless aspect often seen before a storm. The air is extremely heavy, the sea is comparatively calm. In the distance, the clouds have assumed the appearance of enormous balls of cotton, or rather pods, piled one above the other in picturesque confusion. By degrees, they appear to swell out, break, and gain in number what they lose in grandeur. Their heaviness is so great that they are unable to lift themselves from the horizon. But under the influence of the upper currents of air, they are gradually broken up, become much darker, and then present the appearance of one single layer of a formidable character. Now and then a lighter cloud, still lit up from above, rebounds upon this gray carpet and is lost in the opaque mass. There can be no doubt that the entire atmosphere is saturated with electric fluid. I am myself wholly impregnated. My hairs literally stand on end, as if under the influence of a galvanic battery. If one of my companions ventured to touch me, I think he would receive rather a violent and unpleasant shock. About 10 o'clock in the morning, the symptoms of the storm became more thorough and decisive. The wind appeared to soften down as if to take breath for a renewed attack. The vast funereal pall above us looked like a huge bag like the cave of Aeolus, in which the storm was collecting its forces for the attack. I tried all I could not to believe in the menacing signs of the sky, and yet I could not avoid saying, as it were involuntarily, "I believe we are going to have bad weather." The professor made me no answer. He was in a detestable humor to see the ocean stretching interminably before his eyes. On hearing my words, he simply shrugged his shoulders. "We shall have a tremendous storm," I said again, pointing to the horizon. "These clouds are falling lower and lower upon the sea, as if to crush it." A great silence prevailed. The wind wholly ceased. Nature assumed a dead calm and ceased to breathe. Upon the mast, where I noticed a sort of slight ignis fatuus, the sail hangs in loose, heavy folds. The raft is motionless in the midst of a dark, heavy sea without undulation, without motion. It is as still as glass. But as we are making no progress, what is the use of keeping up the sail, which may be the cause of our perdition if the tempest should suddenly strike us without warning? "Let us lower the sail," I said. "It is only an act of common prudence." "No, no," cried my uncle in an exasperated tone, 100 times no. "Let the wind strike us and do its worst. Let the storm sweep us away where it will only let me see the glimmer of some coast of some rocky cliffs, even if they dash our raft into 1,000 pieces. No. Keep up the sail no matter what happens." These words were scarcely uttered when the southern horizon underwent a sudden and violent change. The long accumulated vapors were resolved into water, and the air required to fill up the void produced became a wild and raging tempest. It came from the most distant corners of the mighty cavern. It raged from every point of the compass. It roared, it yelled, it shrieked with glee as of demons let loose. The darkness increased and became indeed darkness visible. The raft rose and fell with the storm and bounded over the waves. My uncle was cast headlong upon the deck. I with great difficulty dragged myself towards him. He was holding on with might and main to the end of a cable, and appeared to gaze with pleasure and delight at the spectacle of the unchained elements. Hands never moved a muscle. His long hair, driven hither and thither by the tempest, and scattered wildly over his motionless face, gave him a most extraordinary appearance for Every single hair was illuminated by little sparkling sprigs. His countenance presents the extraordinary appearance of an antediluvian man, a true contemporary of the megatherium. Still, the mast holds good against the storm. The sail spreads out and fills like a soap bubble about to burst. The raft rushes on at a pace impossible to estimate, but still less swiftly than the body of water displaced beneath it, the rapidity of which may be seen by the lines which fly right and left in the wake. The sail, I cried, making a trumpet of my hands and then endeavoring to lower it. Let it alone, said my uncle, more exasperated than ever. I nudge/I, said Hans, gently shaking his head. Nevertheless, the rain formed a roaring cataract before this horizon of which we were in search, and to which we were rushing like madmen. But before this wilderness of waters reached us, the mighty veil of cloud was torn in twain. The sea began to foam wildly, and the electricity, produced by some vast and extraordinary chemical action in the upper layer of cloud, is brought into play. To the fearful claps of thunder are added dazzling flashes of lightning, such as I had never seen. The flashes crossed one another, hurled from every side, while the thunder came pealing like an echo. The mass of vapor becomes incandescent. The hailstones which strike the metal of our boots and our weapons are actually luminous. The waves as they rise appear to be fire-eating monsters, beneath which seethes an intense fire, their crests surmounted by combs of flame. My eyes are dazzled, blinded by the intensity of light. My ears are deafened by the awful roar of the elements. I am compelled to hold onto the mast, which bends like a reed beneath the violence of the storm, to which none ever before seen by mariners bore any resemblance. Here my traveling notes become very incomplete, loose and vague. I have only been able to make out one or two fugitive observations, jotted down in a mere mechanical way. But even their brevity, even their obscurity, show the emotions which overcame me. Sunday, August 23rd. Where have we got to? In what region are we wandering? We are still carried forward with inconceivable rapidity. The night has been fearful, something not to be described. The storm shows no signs of cessation. We exist in the midst of an uproar which has no name. The detonations as of artillery are incessant. Our ears literally bleed. We are unable to exchange a word or hear each other speak. The lightning never ceases to flash for a single instant. I can see the zigzags after a rapid dart strike the arched roof of this mightiest of mighty vaults. If it were to give way and fall upon us, other lightnings plunge their forked streaks in every direction and take the form of globes of fire, which explode like bombshells over a beleaguered city. The general crash and roar do not apparently increase. It has already gone far beyond what human ear can appreciate. If all the powder magazines in the world were to explode together, it would be impossible for us to hear worse noise. There is a constant emission of light from the storm clouds. The electric matter is incessantly released. Evidently, the gaseous principles of the air are out of order. Innumerable columns of water rush up like waterspouts and fall back upon the surface of the ocean in foam. Whither are we going? My uncle still lies at full length upon the raft, without speaking, without taking any note of time. The heat increases. I look at the thermometer. To my surprise, it indicates the exact figure is here rubbed out in my manuscript, /I. Monday, August 24th. This terrible storm will never end. Why should not this state of the atmosphere, so dense and murky, once modified, again remain definitive? We are utterly broken and harassed by fatigue. Hans remains just as usual. The raft runs to the southeast invariably. We have now already run 200 leagues from the newly discovered island. About 12 o'clock, the storm became worse than ever. We are obliged now to fasten every bit of cargo tightly on the deck of the raft, or everything would be swept away. We make ourselves fast too, each man lashing the other. The waves drive over us, so that several times we are actually underwater. We had been under the painful necessity of abstaining from speech for 3 days and 3 nights. We opened our mouths, we moved our lips, but no sound came. Even when we placed our mouths to each other's ears, it was the same. The wind carried the voice away. My uncle once contrived to get his head close to mine after several, almost vain endeavors. He appeared to my nearly exhausted senses to articulate some word. I had a notion, more from intuition than anything else, that he said to me, "We are lost." I took out my notebook, from which under the most desperate circumstances I never parted, and wrote a few words as legibly as I could. "Taken sail." With a deep sigh, he nodded his head and acquiesced. His head had scarcely time to fall back in the position from which he had momentarily raised it than a disk or ball of fire appeared on the very edge of the raft tower devoted, our doomed craft. The mast and sail are carried away bodily, and I see them swept away to a prodigious height like a kite. We were frozen, actually shivered with terror. The ball of fire, half white, half azure-colored, about the size of a 10-inch bombshell, moved along, turning with prodigious rapidity to leeward of the storm. It ran about here, there, and everywhere. It clambered up one of the bulwarks of the raft. It leaped upon the sack of provisions, and then finally descended lightly, fell like a football, and landed on our powder barrel. Horrible situation. An explosion, of course, was now inevitable. By heaven's mercy, it was not so. The dazzling disk moved on one side. It approached Hans, who looked at it with singular fixity. Then it approached my uncle, who cast himself on his knees to avoid it. It came towards me, as I stood pale and shuddering in the dazzling light and heat. It pirouetted round my feet, which I endeavored to withdraw. An odor of nitrous gas filled the whole air. It penetrated to the throat, to the lungs. I felt ready to choke. Why is it that I cannot withdraw my feet? Are they riveted to the flooring of the raft? No. The fall of the electric globe has turned all the iron on board into lodestones. The instruments, the tools, the arms are clanging together with awful and horrible noise. The nails of my heavy boots adhere closely to the plate of iron incrustated in the wood. I cannot withdraw my foot. It is the old story again of the mountain of adamant. At last, by a violent and almost superhuman effort, I tear it away just as the ball, which is still executing its gyratory motions, is about to run round it and drag me with it if. Oh, what intense, stupendous light! The globe of fire bursts. We are enveloped in cascades of living fire, which flood the space around with luminous matter. Then all went out, and darkness once more fell upon the deep. I had just time to see my uncle once more cast apparently senseless on the flooring of the raft, hands at the helm, spitting fire, under the influence of the electricity which seemed to have gone through him. Whither are we going, I ask? An echo answers, whither? Tuesday, August 25th. I have just come out of a long fainting fit. The awful and hideous storm still continues. The lightning has increased in vividness and pours out its fiery wrath like a brood of serpents let loose in the atmosphere. Are we still upon the sea? Yes, and being carried along with incredible velocity. We have passed under England, under the Channel, under France, probably under the whole extent of Europe. Another awful clamor in the distance. This time it is certain that the sea is breaking upon the rocks at no great distance. Then, Chapter 33. Our route reversed. Here ends what I call my journal of our voyage on board the raft, which journal was happily saved from the wreck. I proceed with my narrative as I did before I commenced my daily notes. What happened when the terrible shock took place? When the raft was cast upon the rocky shore, it would be impossible for me now to say. I felt myself precipitated violently into the boiling waves, and if I escaped from a certain and cruel death, it was wholly owing to the determination of the faithful hands, who, clutching me by the arm, saved me from the yawning abyss. The courageous Icelander then carried me in his powerful arms, far out of the reach of the waves, and laid me down upon a burning expanse of sand, where I found myself some time afterwards in the company of my uncle, the professor. Then he quietly returned towards the fatal rocks, against which the furious waves were beating, in order to save any stray waifs from the wreck. This man was always practical and thoughtful. I could not utter a word. I was quite overcome with emotion. My whole body was broken and bruised with fatigue. It took hours before I was anything like myself. Meanwhile, there fell a fearful deluge of rain, drenching us to the skin. Its very violence, however, proclaimed the approaching end of the storm. Some overhanging rocks afforded us a slight protection from the torrents. Under this shelter, Hans prepared some food, which, however, I was unable to touch. And, exhausted by the 3 weary days and nights of watching, we fell into a deep and painful sleep. My dreams were fearful, but at last exhausted nature asserted her supremacy, and I slumbered. Next day, when I awoke, the change was magical. The weather was magnificent. Air and sea, as if by mutual consent, had regained their serenity. Every trace of the storm, even the faintest, had disappeared. I was saluted on my awakening by the first joyous tones I had heard from the professor for many a day. His gaiety, indeed, was something terrible. "Well, my lad," he cried, rubbing his hands together, "have you slept soundly? Might it not have been supposed that we were in the old house on the Königstrasse, that I had just come down quietly to my breakfast, and that my marriage with Gretchen was to take place that very day?" My uncle's coolness was exasperating. Alas, considering how the tempest had driven us in an easterly direction, we had passed under the whole of Germany, under the city of Hamburg, where I had been so happy, under the very street which contained all I loved and cared for in the world. It was a positive fact that I was only separated from her by a distance of 40 leagues. But these 40 leagues were of hard, impenetrable granite. All these dreary and miserable reflections passed through my mind before I attempted to answer my uncle's question. "Why, what is the matter?" he cried. "Cannot you say whether you have slept well or not?" "I have slept very well," was my reply, "but every bone in my body aches." "I suppose that will lead to nothing." "Nothing at all, my boy. It is only the result of the fatigue of the last few days, that is all. You appear, if I may be allowed to say so, to be very jolly this morning," I said. "Delighted, my dear boy, delighted. Was never happier in my life. We have at last reached the wished-for port." "The end of our expedition," cried I, in a tone of considerable surprise. "No, but to the confines of that sea which I began to fear would never end, but go round the whole world. We will now tranquilly resume our journey by land, and once again endeavor to dive into the center of the earth." "My dear uncle," I began, in a hesitating kind of way, "allow me to ask you one question." "Certainly, Harry, a dozen if you think proper." "One will suffice." "How about getting back?" I asked. "How about getting back? What a question to ask. We have not as yet reached the end of our journey." "I know that. All I want to know is how you propose we shall manage the return voyage." "In the most simple manner in the world," said the imperturbable professor. "Once we reach the exact center of this sphere, either we shall find a new road by which to ascend to the surface, or we shall simply turn round and go back by the way we came. I have every reason to believe that while we are traveling forward, it will not close behind us. Then one of the first matters to see to will be to repair the raft," was my rather melancholy response. "Of course. We must attend to that above all things," continued the professor. "Then comes the all-important question of provisions," I urged. "Have we anything like enough left to enable us to accomplish such great, such amazing, designs as you contemplate carrying out?" I have seen into the matter, and my answer is in the affirmative. Hans is a very clever fellow, and I have reason to believe that he has saved the greater part of the cargo. But the best way to satisfy your scruples is to come and judge for yourself." Saying which, he led the way out of the kind of open grotto in which we had taken shelter. I had almost begun to hope that which I should rather have feared, and this was the impossibility of such a shipwreck leaving even the slightest signs of what it had carried as freight. I was, however, thoroughly mistaken. As soon as I reached the shores of this inland sea, I found Hans standing gravely in the midst of a large number of things laid out in complete order. My uncle wrung his hands with deep and silent gratitude. His heart was too full for speech. This man, whose superhuman devotion to his employers I not only never saw surpassed, nor even equaled, had been hard at work all the time we slept, and at the risk of his life had succeeded in saving the most precious articles of our cargo. Of course, under the circumstances, we necessarily experienced several severe losses. Our weapons had wholly vanished, but experience had taught us to do without them. The provision of powder had, however, remained intact, after having narrowly escaped blowing us all to atoms in the storm. "Well," said the professor, who was now ready to make the best of everything, "as we have no guns, all we have to do is to give up all idea of hunting." "Yes, my dear sir, we can do without them, but what about all our instruments? Here is the manometer, the most useful of all, and which I gladly accept in lieu of the rest. With it alone, I can calculate the depth as we proceed. By its means alone, I shall be able to decide when we have reached the center of the earth." Ha! But for this little instrument, we might make a mistake, and run the risk of coming out at the antipodes. All this was said amid bursts of unnatural laughter. "But the compass," I cried, "without that what can we do?" "Here it is, safe and sound," he cried with real joy. Ah, and here we have the chronometer and the thermometers. Hans the hunter is indeed an invaluable man. It was impossible to deny this fact. As far as the nautical and other instruments were concerned, nothing was wanting. Then on further examination, I found ladders, cords, pickaxes, crowbars, and shovels, all scattered about on the shore. There was, however, finally the most important question of all, and that was provisions. "But what are we to do for food?" I asked. "Let us see to the commissariat department," replied my uncle gravely. The boxes which contained our supply of food for the voyage were placed in a row along the strand, and were in a capital state of preservation. The sea had in every case respected their contents, and to sum up in one sentence, taking into consideration biscuits, salt meat, skedum, and dried fish, we could still calculate on having about 4 months' supply, if used with prudence and caution. 4 months, cried the sanguine professor in high glee. Then we shall have plenty of time both to go and to come, and with what remains, undertake to give a grand dinner to my colleagues of the Johanneum. I sighed. I should, by this time, have become used to the temperament of my uncle, and yet this man astonished me more and more every day. He was the greatest human enigma I ever had known. Now before we do anything else, we must lay in a stock of fresh water. The rain has fallen in abundance and filled the hollows of the granite. There is a rich supply of water, and we have no fear of suffering from thirst, which in our circumstances is of the last importance. As for the raft, I shall recommend Hans to repair it to the best of his abilities, though I have every reason to believe we shall not require it again. "How is that?" I cried, more amazed than ever at my uncle's style of reasoning. "I have an idea, my dear boy. It is none other than this simple fact. We shall not come out by the same opening as that by which we entered." I began to look at my uncle with vague suspicion. An idea had more than once taken possession of me, and this was that he was going mad. And yet, little did I think how true and prophetic his words were doomed to be. "And now," he said, having seen to all these matters of detail, to breakfast. I followed him to a sort of projecting cape, after he had given his last instructions to our guide. In this original position, with dried meat, biscuit, and a delicious cup of tea, we made a satisfactory meal, I may say one of the most welcome and pleasant I ever remember. Exhaustion, the keen atmosphere, the state of calm after so much agitation, all contributed to give me an excellent appetite. Indeed, it contributed very much to producing a pleasant and cheerful state of mind. While breakfast was in hand, and between the sips of warm tea, I asked my uncle if he had any idea of how we now stood in relation to the world above. "For my part," I added, "I think it will be rather difficult to determine." "Well, if we were compelled to fix the exact spot," said my uncle, "it might be difficult, since during the 3 days of that awful tempest, could keep no account either of the quickness of our pace, or of the direction in which the raft was going. Still, we will endeavor to approximate to the truth. We shall not, I believe, be so very far out." "Well, if I recollect rightly," I replied, "our last observation was made at the Geyser Island." "Harry's Island, my boy." "Harry's Island. Do not decline the honor of having named it, given your name to an island discovered by us, the first human beings who trod it since the creation of the world. Let it be so then. At Harry's Island, we had already gone over 270 leagues of sea, and we were, I believe, about 600 leagues, more or less, from Iceland." "Good. I am glad to see that you remember so well. Let us start from that point, and let us count 4 days of storm, during which our rate of traveling must have been very great. I should say that our velocity must have been about 80 leagues to the 24 hours. I agreed that I thought this a fair calculation. There were then 300 leagues to be added to the grand total. Yes, and the Central Sea must extend at least 600 leagues from side to side. Do you know, my boy Harry, that we have discovered an inland lake larger than the Mediterranean? Certainly, and we only know of its extent in one way. It may be hundreds of miles in length. Very likely. Then, said I, after calculating for some minutes, if your provisions are right, we are at this moment exactly under the Mediterranean itself. Do you think so? Yes, I am almost certain of it. Are we not 900 leagues distant from Reykjavik? That is perfectly true, and a famous bit of road we have traveled, my boy. But why we should be under the Mediterranean more than under Turkey or the Atlantic Ocean can only be known when we are sure of not having deviated from our course. And of this, we know nothing. I do not think we were driven very far from our course. The wind appears to me to have been always about the same. My opinion is that this shore must be situated to the southeast of Port Gretchen. Good, I hope so. It will, however, be easy to decide the matter by taking the bearings from our departure by means of the compass. Come along, and we will consult that invaluable invention. The professor now walked eagerly in the direction of the rock, where the indefatigable Hans had placed the instruments in safety. My uncle was gay and light-hearted. He rubbed his hands and assumed all sorts of attitudes. He was to all appearance once more a young man. Since I had known him, never had he been so amiable and pleasant. I followed him, rather curious to know whether I had made any mistake in my estimation of our position. As soon as we had reached the rock, my uncle took the compass, placed it horizontally before him, and looked keenly at the needle. As he had at first shaken it to give it vivacity, it oscillated considerably, and then slowly assumed its right position under the influence of the magnetic power. The professor bent his eyes curiously over the wondrous instrument. A violent start immediately showed the extent of his emotion. He closed his eyes, rubbed them, and took another and a keener survey. Then he turned slowly round to me, stupefaction depicted on his countenance. "What is the matter?" said I, beginning to be alarmed. He could not speak. He was too overwhelmed for words. He simply pointed to the instrument. I examined it eagerly according to his mute directions, and a loud cry of surprise escaped my lips. The needle of the compass pointed due northen. The direction we expected was the south. It pointed to the shore instead of to the high seas. I shook the compass. I examined it with a curious and anxious eye. It was in a state of perfection. No blemish in any way explained the phenomenon. Whatever position we forced the needle into, it returned invariably to the same unexpected point. It was useless attempting to conceal from ourselves the fatal truth. There could be no doubt about it, unwelcome as was the fact, that during the tempest there had been a sudden slant of wind, of which we had been unable to take any account, and thus the raft had carried us back to the shores we had left, apparently forever, so many days before. Chapter 34. A Voyage of Discovery. It would be altogether impossible for me to give any idea of the utter astonishment which overcame the professor on making this extraordinary discovery. Amazement, incredulity, and rage were blended in such a way as to alarm me. During the whole course of my life, I had never seen a man at first so chapfallen, and then so furiously indignant. The terrible fatigues of our sea voyage, the fearful dangers we had passed through, had all gone for nothing. We had to begin them all over again. Instead of progressing, as we fondly expected, during a voyage of so many days, we had retreated. Every hour of our expedition on the raft had been so much lost time. Presently, however, the indomitable energy of my uncle overcame every other consideration. "So," he said, between his set teeth, "fatality will play me these terrible tricks. The elements themselves conspire to overwhelm me with mortification. Air, fire, and water combine their united efforts to oppose my passage. Well, they shall see what the earnest will of a determined man can do. I will not yield, I will not retreat even 1 inch, and we shall see who shall triumph in this great contest, man or nature. Standing upright on a rock, irritated and menacing, Professor Hardwigg, like the ferocious Ajax, seemed to defy the fates. I, however, took upon myself to interfere, and to impose some sort of check upon such insensate enthusiasm. "Listen to me, uncle," I said, in a firm but temperate tone of voice. "There must be some limit to ambition here below. It is utterly useless to struggle against the impossible. Pray listen to reason. We are utterly unprepared for a sea voyage. It is simply madness to think of performing a journey of 500 leagues upon a wretched pile of beams, with a counterpane for a sail, a paltry stick for a mast, and a tempest to contend with. As we are totally incapable of steering our frail craft, we shall become the mere plaything of the storm, and it is acting the part of madmen if we, a second time, run any risk upon this dangerous and treacherous central sea. These are only a few of the reasons and arguments. I put together reasons and arguments which to me appeared unanswerable. I was allowed to go on without interruption for about 10 minutes. The explanation to this I soon discovered. The professor was not even listening, and did not hear a word of all my eloquence. "To the raft," he cried in a hoarse voice when I paused for a reply. Such was the result of my strenuous effort to resist his iron will. I tried again, I begged and implored him, I got into a passion, but I had to deal with a will more determined than my own. I seemed to feel like the waves which fought and battled against the huge mass of granite at our feet, which had smiled grimly for so many ages at their puny efforts. Hans, meanwhile, without taking part in our discussion, had been repairing the raft. One would have supposed that he instinctively guessed at the further projects of my uncle. By means of some fragments of cordage, he had again made the raft seaworthy. While I had been speaking, he had hoisted a new mast and sail, the latter already fluttering and waving in the breeze. The worthy professor spoke a few words to our imperturbable guide, who immediately began to put our baggage on board and to prepare for our departure. The atmosphere was now tolerably clear and pure, and the northeast wind blew steadily and serenely. It appeared likely to last for some time. What then could I do? Could I undertake to resist the iron will of 2 men? It was simply impossible, if even I could have hoped for the support of Hans. This, however, was out of the question. It appeared to me that the Icelander had set aside all personal will and identity. He was a picture of abnegation. I could hope for nothing from one so infatuated with and devoted to his master. All I could do, therefore, was to swim with the stream. In a mood of stolid and sullen resignation, I was about to take my accustomed place on the raft when my uncle placed his hand upon my shoulder. "There is no hurry, my boy," he said. "We shall not start until tomorrow." I looked the picture of resignation to the dire will of fate. "Under the circumstances," he said, "I ought to neglect no precautions. As fate has cast me upon these shores, I shall not leave without having completely examined them." In order to understand this remark, I must explain that though we had been driven back to the northern shore, we had landed at a very different spot from that which had been our starting point. Port Gretchen must, we calculated, be very much to the westward. Nothing, therefore, was more natural and reasonable than that we should reconnoiter this new shore upon which we had so unexpectedly landed. "Let us go on a journey of discovery," I cried. And leaving Hans to his important operation, we started on our expedition. The distance between the foreshore at high water and the foot of the rocks was considerable. It would take about half an hour's walking to get from one to the other. As we trudged along, our feet crushed innumerable shells of every shape, and size once the dwelling place of animals of every period of creation. I particularly noticed some enormous shells carapaces, turtle and tortoise species, the diameter of which exceeded 15 feet. They had in past ages belonged to those gigantic glyptodons of the Pliocene period, of which the modern turtle is but a minute specimen. In addition, the whole soil was covered by a vast quantity of stony relics, having the appearance of flints worn by the action of the waves, and lying in successive layers one above the other. I came to the conclusion that in past ages the sea must have covered the whole district. Upon the scattered rocks, now lying far beyond its reach, the mighty waves of ages had left evident marks of their passage. On reflection, this appeared to me partially to explain the existence of this remarkable ocean, 40 leagues below the surface of the Earth's crust. According to my new, and perhaps fanciful, theory, this liquid mass must be gradually lost in the deep bowels of the Earth. I had also no doubt that this mysterious sea was fed by infiltration of the ocean above, through imperceptible fissures. Nevertheless, it was impossible not to admit that these fissures must now be nearly choked up. For if not, the cavern, or rather the immense and stupendous reservoir, would have been completely filled in a short space of time. Perhaps even this water, having to contend against the accumulated subterraneous fires of the interior of the Earth, had become partially vaporized. Hence the explanation of those heavy clouds suspended over our heads, and the superabundant display of that electricity, which occasioned such terrible storms in this deep and cavernous sea. This lucid explanation of the phenomena we had witnessed appeared to me quite satisfactory. However great and mighty the marvels of nature may seem to us, they are always to be explained by physical reasons. Everything is subordinate to some great law of nature. It now appeared clear that we were walking upon a kind of sedimentary soil, formed like all the soils of that period, so frequent on the surface of the globe by the subsidence of the waters. The professor, who was now in his element, carefully examined every rocky fissure. Let him only find an opening, and it directly became important to him to examine its depth. For a whole mile we followed the windings of the central sea, when suddenly an important change took place in the aspect of the soil. It seemed to have been rudely cast up, convulsionized, as it were, by a violent upheaving of the lower strata. In many places, hollows here and hillocks there attested great dislocations at some other period of the terrestrial mass. We advanced with great difficulty over the broken masses of granite mixed with flint, quartz, and alluvial deposits, when a large field, more even than a field, a plain of bones, appeared suddenly before our eyes. It looked like an immense cemetery, where generation after generation had mingled their mortal dust. Lofty barrows of early remains rose at intervals. They undulated away to the limits of the distant horizon, and were lost in a thick and brown fog. On that spot, some 3 square miles in extent, was accumulated the whole history of animal life, scarcely one creature, upon the comparatively modern soil of the upper and inhabited world, had not there existed. Nevertheless, we were drawn forward by an all-absorbing and impatient curiosity. Our feet crushed with a dry and crackling sound the remains of those prehistoric fossils, for which the museums of great cities quarrel, even when they obtain only rare and curious morsels. 1,000 such naturalists as Cuvier would not have sufficed to recompose the skeletons of the organic beings, which lay in this magnificent osseous collection. I was utterly confounded. My uncle stood for some minutes with his arms raised on high towards the thick granite vault, which served us for a sky. His mouth was wide open. His eyes sparkled wildly behind his spectacles, which he had fortunately saved. His head bobbed up and down and from side to side, while his whole attitude and mien expressed unbounded astonishment. He stood in the presence of an endless, wondrous, and inexhaustibly rich collection of antediluvian monsters, piled up for his own private and peculiar satisfaction. Fancy, an enthusiastic lover of books, carried suddenly into the very midst of the famous library of Alexandria, burned by the sacrilegious Omar, and which some miracle had restored to its pristine splendor. Such was something of the state of mind in which Uncle Hardwigg was now placed. For some time he stood thus, literally aghast at the magnitude of his discovery. But it was even a greater excitement when, darting wildly over this mass of organic dust, he caught up a naked skull and addressed me in a quivering voice. "Harry, my boy Harry, this is a human head." "A human head, uncle," I said, no less amazed and stupefied than himself. "Yes, nephew." "Ah, Mr. Milne Edwards, ah. Mr. de Quatrefages, why are you not here where I am I, Professor Hardwigg?" Chapter 35. Discovery upon Discovery. In order fully to understand the exclamation made by my uncle, and his allusions to these illustrious and learned men, it will be necessary to enter into certain explanations in regard to a circumstance of the highest importance to paleontology, or the science of fossil life, which had taken place a short time before our departure from the upper regions of the earth. On the 28th of March, 1863, some navigators under the direction of 1,000 Boucher de Perths were at work in the great quarries of Moulin-Quignon, near Abbeville, in the department of the Somme, in France. While at work, they unexpectedly came upon a human jawbone buried 14 feet below the surface of the soil. It was the first fossil of the kind that had ever been brought to the light of day. Near this unexpected human relic were found stone hatchets and carved flints, colored and clothed by time in one uniform brilliant tint of verdigris. The report of this extraordinary and unexpected discovery spread not only all over France, but over England and Germany. Many learned men belonging to various scientific bodies, and noteworthy among others Messrs. Milne Edwards and de Quatrefages, took the affair very much to heart, demonstrated the incontestable authenticity of the bone in question, and became, to use the phrase then recognized in England, the most ardent supporters of the jawbone question. To the eminent geologists of the United Kingdom, who looked upon the fact as certain Messrs. Falconer, Buck, Carpenter, and others were soon united the learned men of Germany, and among those in the first rank, the most eager, the most enthusiastic, was my worthy uncle, Professor Hardwigg. The authenticity of a human fossil of the Quaternary period seemed then to be incontestably demonstrated, and even to be admitted by the most skeptical. This system or theory, call it what you will, had, it is true, a bitter adversary in 1,000. Élie de Beaumont. This learned man, who holds such a high place in the scientific world, holds that the soil of Moulin-Quignon does not belong to the diluvium, but to a much less ancient stratum. And, in accordance with Cuvier in this respect, he would by no means admit that the human species was contemporary with the animals of the Quaternary epoch. My worthy uncle, Professor Hardwigg, in concert with the great majority of geologists, had held firm, had disputed, discussed, and finally, after considerable talking and writing, 1,000. Élie de Beaumont had been pretty well left alone in his opinions. We were familiar with all the details of this discussion, but were far from being aware then that since our departure, the matter had entered upon a new phase. Other similar jawbones, though belonging to individuals of varied types and very different natures, had been found in the movable gray sands of certain grottos in France, Switzerland, and Belgium, together with arms, utensils, tools, bones of children, of men in the prime of life, and of old men. The existence of men in the Quaternary period became, therefore, more positive every day. But this was far from being all. New remains, dug up from the Pliocene or Tertiary deposits, had enabled the more far-seeing or audacious among learned men to assign even a far greater degree of antiquity to the human race. These remains, it is true, were not those of men, that is, were not the bones of men, but objects decidedly having served the human race. Shin bones, thigh bones of fossil animals regularly scooped out, and in fact sculptured bearing the unmistakable signs of human handiwork. By means of these wondrous and unexpected discoveries, man ascended endless centuries in the scale of time. He, in fact, preceded the mastodon, became the contemporary of the I. Elephas meridionalis / I. the southern elephant, acquired an antiquity of over 100,000 years, since that is the date given by the most eminent geologists to the Pliocene period of the Earth. Such was then the state of paleontologic science, and what we moreover knew sufficed to explain our attitude before this great cemetery of the plains of the Hardwigg Ocean. It will now be easy to understand the professor's mingled astonishment and joy when, on advancing about 20 yards, he found himself in the presence of, I may say face to face with, a specimen of the human race actually belonging to the Quaternary period. It was indeed a human skull, perfectly recognizable. Had a soil of very peculiar nature, like that of the cemetery of St. Michel at Bordeaux, preserved it during countless ages. This was the question I asked myself, but which I was wholly unable to answer. But this head with stretched and parchmenty skin, with the teeth whole, the hair abundant, was before our eyes as in life. I stood mute, almost paralyzed with wonder and awe before this dread apparition of another age. My uncle, who on almost every occasion was a great talker, remained for a time completely dumbfounded. He was too full of emotion for speech to be possible. After a while, however, we raised up the body to which the skull belonged. We stood it on end. It seemed, to our excited imaginations, to look at us with its terrible hollow eyes. After some minutes of silence, the man was vanquished by the professor. Human instincts succumbed to scientific pride and exultation. Professor Hardwigg, carried away by his enthusiasm, forgot all the circumstances of our journey, the extraordinary position in which we were placed, the immense cavern which stretched far away over our heads. There can be no doubt that he thought himself at the institution addressing his attentive pupils, for he put on his most doctorial style, waved his hand, and began. "Gentlemen, I have the honor on this auspicious occasion to present to you a man of the quaternary period of our globe. Many learned men have denied his very existence, while other able persons, perhaps of even higher authority, have affirmed their belief in the reality of his life. If the St. Thomases of paleontology were present, they would reverentially touch him with their fingers and believe in his existence, thus acknowledging their obstinate heresy. I know that science should be careful in relation to all discoveries of this nature. I am not without having heard of the many Barnums and other quacks who have made a trade of such-like pretended discoveries. I have, of course, heard of the discovery of the knee bones of Ajax, of the pretended finding of the body of Orestes by the Spartiates, and of the body of Asterius, 10 spans long, 15 feet of which we read in Pausanias. I have read everything in relation to the skeleton of Trapani, discovered in the 14th century, and which many persons chose to regard as that of Polyphemus, and the history of the giant dug up during the 16th century in the environs of Palmyra. You are well aware, as I am, gentlemen, of the existence of the celebrated analysis made near Lucerne, in 1577, of the great bones which the celebrated Dr. Felix Plater declared belonged to a giant about 19 feet high. I have devoured all the treatises of Cassanian, and all those memoirs, pamphlets, speeches, and replies published in reference to the skeleton of Teutobachus, king of the Cimbri, the invader of Gaul, dug out of a gravel pit in Dauphine in 1613. In the 18th century, I should have denied, with Peter Campet, the existence of the preadamites of Schutzer. I have had in my hands the writing called Giggins. Here my uncle was afflicted by the natural infirmity, which prevented him from pronouncing difficult words in public. It was not exactly stuttering, but a strange sort of constitutional hesitation. The writing named Giggins he repeated. He, however, could get no further. Gigantea. Impossible. The unfortunate word would not come out. There would have been great laughter at the institution had the mistake happened there. Gigantosteology, at last exclaimed Professor Hardwigg between two savage growls. Having got over our difficulty, and getting more and more excited. Yes, gentlemen, I am well acquainted with all these matters, and know, also, that Cuvier and Blumenbach fully recognized in these bones the undeniable remains of mammoths of the quaternary period. But after what we now see, to allow a doubt is to insult scientific inquiry. There is the body, you can see it, you can touch it. It is not a skeleton, it is a complete and uninjured body, preserved with an anthropological object. I did not attempt to controvert this singular and astounding assertion. If I could but wash this corpse in a solution of sulfuric acid, continued my uncle, I would undertake to remove all the earthy particles and these resplendent shells, which are encrusted all over this body. But I am without this precious dissolving medium. Nevertheless, such as it is, this body will tell its own history. Here the professor held up the fossil body and exhibited it with rare dexterity. No professional showman could have shown more activity. As on examination you will see, my uncle continued, it is only about 6 feet in length, which is a long way from the pretended giants of early days. As to the particular race to which it belonged, it is incontestably Caucasian. It is of the white race, that is, of our own. The skull of this fossil being is a perfect ovoid without any remarkable or prominent development of the cheekbones, and without any projection of the jaw. It presents no indication of the prognathism, which modifies the facial angle. Measure the angle for yourselves, and you will find that it is just 90 degrees. But I will advance still farther on the road of inquiry and deduction, and I dare venture to say that this human sample or specimen belongs to the Japhetic family, which spread over the world from India to the uttermost limits of Western Europe. There is no occasion, gentlemen, to smile at my remarks. The facial angle is formed by two planes, one more or less vertical, which is in a straight line with the forehead and the incisors, the other, horizontal, which passes through the organs of hearing and the lower nasal bone. Prognathism, in anthropological language, means that particular projection of the jaw which modifies the facial angle. Of course, nobody smiled, but the excellent professor was so accustomed to beaming countenances at his lectures that he believed he saw all his audience laughing during the delivery of his learned dissertation. Yes, he continued with renewed animation, this is a fossil man, a contemporary of the mastodons, with the bones of which this whole amphitheater is covered. But if I am called on to explain how he came to this place, how these various strata by which he is covered have fallen into this vast cavity, I can undertake to give you no explanation. Doubtless, if we carry ourselves back to the Quaternary epoch, we shall find that great and mighty convulsions took place in the crust of the earth. The continually cooling operation, through which the earth had to pass, produced fissures, landslips, and chasms, through which a large portion of the earth made its way. I come to no absolute conclusion, but there is the man, surrounded by the works of his hands, his hatchets and his carved flints, which belong to the stony period. And the only rational supposition is that, like myself, he visited the center of the earth as a traveling tourist, a pioneer of science. At all events, there can be no doubt of his great age, and of his being one of the oldest race of human beings. The professor with these words ceased his oration, and I burst forth into loud and unanimous applause. Besides, after all, my uncle was right. Much more learned men than his nephew would have found it rather hard to refute his facts and arguments. Another circumstance soon presented itself. This fossilized body was not the only one in this vast plain of bones, the cemetery of an extinct world. Other bodies were found, as we trod the dusty plain, and my uncle was able to choose the most marvelous of these specimens in order to convince the most incredulous. In truth, it was a surprising spectacle. The successive remains of generations and generations of men and animals confounded together in one vast cemetery. But a great question now presented itself to our notice, and one we were actually afraid to contemplate in all its bearings. Had these once animated beings been buried so far beneath the soil by some tremendous convulsion of nature, after they had been earth to earth and ashes to ashes, or had they lived here below, in this subterranean world, under this factitious sky, born, married, and given in marriage, and died at last, just like ordinary inhabitants of the earth? Up to the present moment, marine monsters, fish, and such-like animals had alone been seen alive. The question which rendered us rather uneasy was a pertinent one. Were any of these men of the abyss wandering about the deserted shores of this wondrous sea of the center of the earth? This was a question which rendered me very uneasy and uncomfortable. How should they really be in existence? Would they receive us men from above? Chapter 36. What is it? For a long and weary hour, we tramped over this great bed of bones. We advanced regardless of everything, drawn on by ardent curiosity. What other marvels did this great cavern contain? What other wondrous treasures for the scientific man? My eyes were quite prepared for any number of surprises. My imagination lived in expectation of something new and wonderful. The borders of the great central ocean had for some time disappeared behind the hills that were scattered over the ground, occupied by the plain of bones. The imprudent and enthusiastic professor, who did not care whether he lost himself or not, hurried me forward. We advanced silently, bathed in waves of electric fluid. By reason of a phenomenon which I cannot explain, and thanks to its extreme diffusion, now complete, the light illumined equally the sides of every hill and rock. Its seat appeared to be nowhere, in no determined force, and produced no shade whatever. The appearance presented was that of a tropical country at midday in summer, the midst of the equatorial regions, and under the vertical rays of the sun. All signs of vapor had disappeared. The rocks, the distant mountains, some confused masses of far-off forests, assumed a weird and mysterious aspect under this equal distribution of the luminous fluid. We resembled, to a certain extent, the mysterious personage in one of Hoffmann's fantastic tales, The Man Who Lost His Shadow. After we had walked about a mile farther, we came to the edge of a vast forest, not, however, one of the vast mushroom forests we had discovered near Port Gretchen. It was the glorious and wild vegetation of the Tertiary period, in all its superb magnificence. Huge palms, of a species now unknown, superb Pomicites, a genus of fossil palms from the coal formation pines, yews, cypress, and conifers or cone-bearing trees, the whole bound together by an inextricable and complicated mass of creeping plants. A beautiful carpet of mosses and ferns grew beneath the trees. Pleasant brooks murmured beneath umbrageous boughs, little worthy of this name, for no shade did they give. Upon their borders grew small tree-like shrubs, such as are seen in the hot countries on our own inhabited globe. The one thing wanting in these plants, these shrubs, these trees was color. Forever deprived of the vivifying warmth of the sun, they were vapid and colorless. All shade was lost in one uniform tint, of a brown and faded character. The leaves were wholly devoid of verdure, and the flowers, so numerous during the Tertiary period which gave them birth, were without color and without perfume, something like paper discolored by long exposure to the atmosphere. My uncle ventured beneath the gigantic groves. I followed him, though not without a certain amount of apprehension. Since nature had shown herself capable of producing such stupendous vegetable supplies, why might we not meet with mammals just as large and therefore dangerous? I particularly remarked, in the clearings left by trees that had fallen and been partially consumed by time, many leguminous, bean-like shrubs, such as the maple and other eatable trees, dear to ruminating animals. Then there appeared confounded together and intermixed, the trees of such varied lands, specimens of the vegetation of every part of the globe. There was the oak near the palm tree, the Australian eucalyptus, an interesting class of the order Myotaceae leaning against the tall Norwegian pine, the poplar of the north, mixing its branches with those of the New Zealand kauris. It was enough to drive the most ingenious classifier of the upper regions out of his mind, and to upset all his received ideas about botany. Suddenly I stopped short and restrained my uncle. The extreme diffuseness of the light enabled me to see the smallest objects in the distant copses. I thought I saw no. I really did see with my own eyes immense, gigantic animals moving about under the mighty trees. Yes, they were truly gigantic animals, a whole herd of mastodons, not fossils, but living, and exactly like those discovered in 1801 on the marshy banks of the Great Ohio in North America. Yes, I could see these enormous elephants, whose trunks were tearing down large boughs and working in and out the trees like a legion of serpents. I could hear the sounds of the mighty tusks uprooting huge trees. The boughs crackled, and the whole masses of leaves and green branches went down the capacious throats of these terrible monsters. That wondrous dream, when I saw the antehistorical times revivified, when the Tertiary and Quaternary periods passed before me, was now realized. And there we were alone, far down in the bowels of the earth, at the mercy of its ferocious inhabitants. My uncle paused, full of wonder and astonishment. "Come," he said at last, when his first surprise was over, "come along, my boy, and let us see them nearer." "No," replied I, restraining his efforts to drag me forward, "we are wholly without arms. What should we do in the midst of that flock of gigantic quadrupeds? Come away, uncle, I implore you. No human creature can, with impunity, brave the ferocious anger of these monsters." "No human creature," said my uncle, suddenly lowering his voice to a mysterious whisper. "You are mistaken, my dear Henry. Look yonder. It seems to me that I behold a human being, a being like ourselves, a man." I looked, shrugging my shoulders, decided to push incredulity to its very last limits. But whatever might have been my wish, I was compelled to yield to the weight of ocular demonstration. Yes, not more than a quarter of a mile off, leaning against the trunk of an enormous tree, was a human being, a proteus of these subterranean regions, a new son of Neptune keeping this innumerable herd of mastodons. Immanis pecoris custos, Immanur ips. The keeper of gigantic cattle, himself still more gigantic. Yes, it was no longer a fossil whose corpse we had raised from the ground in the great cemetery, but a giant capable of guiding and driving these prodigious monsters. His height was above 12 feet. His head, as big as the head of a buffalo, was lost in a mane of matted hair. It was indeed a huge mane, like those which belonged to the elephants of the earlier ages of the world. In his hand was a branch of a tree, which served as a crook for this antediluvian shepherd. We remained profoundly still, speechless with surprise. But we might at any moment be seen by him. Nothing remained for us but instant flight. "Come, come," I cried, dragging my uncle along, and, for the first time, he made no resistance to my wishes. A quarter of an hour later, we were far away from that terrible monster. Now that I think of the matter calmly, and that I reflect upon it dispassionately, now that months, years have passed since this strange and unnatural adventure befell us, what am I to think? What am I to believe? No, it is utterly impossible. Our ears must have deceived us, and our eyes have cheated us. We have not seen what we believed we had seen. No human being could, by any possibility, have existed in that subterranean world. No generation of men could inhabit the lower caverns of the globe without taking note of those who peopled the surface, without communication with them. It was folly, folly, folly. Nothing else. I am rather inclined to admit the existence of some animal resembling in structure the human race of some monkey of the first geological epochs, like that discovered by 1000. Lartet in the ossiferous deposit of Sanson. But this animal, or being, whichsoever it was, surpassed in height all things known to modern science. Never mind. However unlikely it may be, it might have been a monkey but a living man, and with him a whole generation of gigantic animals, buried in the entrails of the earth. It was too monstrous to be believed. Chapter 37. The Mysterious Dagger. During this time, we had left the bright and transparent forest far behind us. We were mute with astonishment, overcome by a kind of feeling which was next door to apathy. We kept running in spite of ourselves. It was a perfect right, which resembled one of those horrible sensations we sometimes meet with in our dreams. Instinctively, we made our way towards the central sea, and I cannot now tell what wild thoughts passed through my mind, nor of what follies I might have been guilty, but for a very serious preoccupation which brought me back to practical life. Though I was aware that we were treading on a soil quite new to us, I, however, every now and then noticed certain aggregations of rock, the shape of which forcibly reminded me of those near Port Gretchen. This confirmed, moreover, the indications of the compass and our extraordinary and unlooked for, as well as involuntary, return to the north of this great central sea. It was so like our starting point that I could scarcely doubt the reality of our position. Streams and cascades fell in hundreds over the numerous projections of the rocks. I actually thought I could see our faithful and monotonous hands and the wonderful grotto in which I had come back to life after my tremendous fall. Then, as we advanced still farther, the position of the cliffs, the appearance of a stream, the unexpected profile of a rock, threw me again into a state of bewildering doubt. After some time, I explained my state of mental indecision to my uncle. He confessed to a similar feeling of hesitation. He was totally unable to make up his mind in the midst of this extraordinary but uniform panorama. "There can be no doubt," I insisted, "that we have not landed exactly at the place whence we first took our departure, but the tempest has brought us above our starting point. I think, therefore, that if we follow the coast we shall once more find Port Gretchen." "In that case," cried my uncle, "it is useless to continue our exploration. The very best thing we can do is to make our way back to the raft." "Are you quite sure, Harry, that you are not mistaken?" "It is difficult," was my reply, to come to any decision, for all these rocks are exactly alike. There is no marked difference between them. At the same time, the impression on my mind is that I recognize the promontory at the foot of which our worthy hands constructed the raft. We are, I am nearly convinced, near the little port. If this be not it, added, carefully examining a creek which appeared singularly familiar to my mind. My dear Harry, if this were the case, we should find traces of our own footsteps, some signs of our passage, and I can really see nothing to indicate our having passed this way. But I see something, I cried, in an impetuous tone of voice, as I rushed forward and eagerly picked up something which shone in the sand under my feet. "What is it?" cried the astonished and bewildered professor. This was my reply, and I handed to my startled relative a rusty dagger, of singular shape. "What made you bring with you so useless a weapon?" he exclaimed. "It was needlessly hampering yourself." "I bring it. It is quite new to me." "I never saw it before. Are you sure it is not out of your collection?" "Not that I know of," said the professor, puzzled. "I have no recollection of the circumstance. It was never my property." "This is very extraordinary," I said, musing over the novel and singular incident. "Not at all. There is a very simple explanation, Harry. The Icelanders are known to keep up the use of these antiquated weapons, and this must have belonged to Hans, who has let it fall without knowing it." I shook my head. That dagger had never been in the possession of the pacific and taciturn Hans. I knew him and his habits too well. "Then what can it be unless it be the weapon of some antediluvian warrior?" I continued, "of some living man, a contemporary of that mighty shepherd from whom we have just escaped. But no mystery upon mystery, this is no weapon of the stony epoch, nor even of the bronze period. It is made of excellent steel." Ere I could finish my sentence, my uncle stopped me short from entering upon a whole train of theories, and spoke in his most cold and decided tone of voice. "Calm yourself, my dear boy, and endeavor to use your reason. This weapon, upon which we have fallen so unexpectedly, is a true eye, one of those worn by gentlemen in their belts during the 16th century. Its use was to give the eye coup de grace/eye, the final blow, to the foe who would not surrender. It is clearly of Spanish workmanship. It belongs neither to you, nor to me, nor the eiderdown hunter, nor to any of the living beings who may still exist so marvelously in the interior of the earth." "What can you mean, uncle?" I said, now lost in a host of surmises. "Look closely at it," he continued. "These jagged edges were never made by the resistance of human blood and bone. The blade is covered with a regular coating of iron mold and rust, which is not a day old, not a year old, not a century old, but much more." The professor began to get quite excited, according to custom, and was allowing himself to be carried away by his fertile imagination. I could have said something. He stopped me. "Harry," he cried, "we are now on the verge of a great discovery. This blade of a dagger you have so marvelously discovered, after being abandoned upon the sand for more than 100, 200, even 300 years, has been indented by someone endeavoring to carve an inscription on these rocks." "But this poniard never got here of itself," I exclaimed. "It could not have twisted itself. Someone, therefore, must have preceded us upon the shores of this extraordinary sea." "Yes, a man. But what man has been sufficiently desperate to do such a thing? A man who has somewhere written his name with this very dagger, a man who has endeavored once more to indicate the right road to the interior of the earth. Let us look around, my boy. You know not the importance of your singular and happy discovery." Prodigiously interested, we walked along the wall of rock, examining the smallest fissures, which might finally expand into the much wished-for gully or shaft. We at last reached a spot where the shore became extremely narrow. The sea almost bathed the foot of the rocks, which were here very lofty and steep. There was scarcely a path wider than 2 yards at any point. At last, under a huge overhanging rock, we discovered the entrance of a dark and gloomy tunnel. There, on a square tablet of granite, which had been smoothed by rubbing it with another stone, we could see 2 mysterious and much worn letters, the 2 initials of the bold and extraordinary traveler who had preceded us on our adventurous journey. "A. S," cried my uncle. You see, I was right. Arn Saknussemm, always Arn Saknussemm. Chapter 38. No outlet blasting the rock. Ever since the commencement of our marvelous journey, I had experienced many surprises, had suffered from many illusions. I thought that I was case-hardened against all surprises, and could neither see nor hear anything to amaze me again. I was like a many who, having been round the world, finds himself wholly blasé and proof against the marvelous. When, however, I saw these two letters, which had been engraven 300 years before, I stood fixed in an attitude of mute surprise. Not only was there the signature of the learned and enterprising alchemist written in the rock, but I held in my hand the very identical instrument with which he had laboriously engraved it. It was impossible, without showing an amount of incredulity scarcely becoming a sane man, to deny the existence of the traveler, and the reality of that voyage which I believed all along to have been a mystification of some fertile brain. While these reflections were passing through my mind, my uncle, the professor, gave way to an access of feverish and poetical excitement. "Wonderful and glorious genius, great Saknussemm," he cried. "You have left no stone unturned, no resource omitted, to show to other mortals the way into the interior of our mighty globe, and your fellow creatures can find the trail left by your illustrious footsteps 300 years ago at the bottom of these obscure subterranean abodes. You have been careful to secure for others the contemplation of these wonders and marvels of creation. Your name engraved at every important stage of your glorious journey leads the hopeful traveler direct to the great and mighty discovery to which you devoted such energy and courage. The audacious traveler, who shall follow your footsteps to the last, will doubtless find your initials engraved with your own hand upon the center of the earth. I will be that audacious traveler. I, too, will sign my name upon the very same spot, upon the central granite stone of this wondrous work of the Creator. But in justice to your devotion, to your courage, and to your being the first to indicate the road, let this cape, seen by you upon the shores of this sea discovered by you, be called, of all time, Cape Saknussemm." This is what I heard, and I began to be roused to the pitch of enthusiasm indicated by those words. A fierce excitement roused me. I forgot everything. The dangers of the voyage and the perils of the return journey were now as nothing. What another man had done in ages past could, I felt, be done again. I was determined to do it myself, and now nothing that man had accomplished appeared to me impossible. "Forward, forward," I cried in a burst of genuine and hearty enthusiasm. I had already started in the direction of the somber and gloomy gallery when the professor stopped me. He, the man so rash and hasty, he, the man so easily roused to the highest pitch of enthusiasm, checked me, and asked me to be patient and show more calm. "Let us return to our good friend Hans," he said. "We will then bring the raft down to this place." I must say that though I at once yielded to my uncle's request, it was not without dissatisfaction, and I hastened along the rocks of that wonderful coast. "Do you know, my dear uncle," I said, as we walked along, "that we have been singularly helped by a concurrence of circumstances, right up to this very moment." "So you begin to see it, do you, Harry?" said the professor with a smile. "Doubtless," I responded, "and strangely enough, even the tempest has been the means of putting us on the right road." Blessings on the tempest. It brought us safely back to the very spot from which fine weather would have driven us forever. Supposing we had succeeded in reaching the southern and distant shores of this extraordinary sea, what would have become of us? The name of Saknussemm would never have appeared to us, and at this moment we should have been cast away upon an inhospitable coast, probably without an outlet. Yes, Harry, my boy, there is certainly something providential in that wandering at the mercy of wind and waves towards the south. We have come back exactly north, and what is better still, we fall upon this great discovery of Cape Saknussemm. I mean to say that it is more than surprising. There is something in it which is far beyond my comprehension. The coincidence is unheard of, marvelous. What matter? It is not our duty to explain facts, but to make the best possible use of them. "Doubtless, my boy, but if you will allow me," said the really delighted professor. "Excuse me, sir, but I see exactly how it will be. We shall take the northern route. We shall pass under the northern regions of Europe, under Sweden, under Russia, under Siberia, and who knows where instead of burying ourselves under the burning plains and deserts of Africa or beneath the mighty waves of the ocean. And that is all, at this stage of our journey, that I care to know. Let us advance, and heaven will be our guide. Yes, Harry, you are right, quite right, all is for the best. Let us abandon this horizontal sea, which could never have led to anything satisfactory. We shall descend, and everlastingly descend. Do you know, my dear boy, that to reach the interior of the earth we have only 5,000 miles to travel? Bah, I cried, carried away by a burst of enthusiasm, the distance is scarcely worth speaking about. The thing is to make a start. My wild, mad, and incoherent speeches continued until we rejoined our patient and phlegmatic guide. All was, we found, prepared for an immediate departure. There was not a single parcel, but what was in its proper place. We all took up our posts on the raft, and the sail being hoisted, Hans received his directions and guided the frail bark towards Cape Saknussemm, as we had definitely named it. The wind was very unfavorable to a craft that was unable to sail close to the wind. It was constructed to go before the blast. We were continually reduced to pushing ourselves forward by means of poles. On several occasions, the rocks ran far out into deep water, and we were compelled to make a long round. At last, after 3 long and weary hours of navigation, that is to say, about 6 o'clock in the evening, we found a place at which we could land. I jumped on shore first. In my present state of excitement and enthusiasm, I was always first. My uncle and the Icelander followed. The voyage from the port to this point of the sea had by no means calmed me. It had rather produced the opposite effect. I even proposed to burn our vessel, that is, to destroy our raft, in order to completely cut off our retreat. But my uncle sternly opposed this wild project. I began to think him particularly lukewarm and unenthusiastic. At any rate, my dear uncle, I said, let us start without delay. Yes, my boy, I am quite as eager to do so as you can be. But in the first place, let us examine this mysterious gallery, in order to find if we shall need to prepare and mend our ladders. My uncle now began to see to the efficiency of our Ruhmkorff coil, which would doubtless soon be needed. The raft, securely fastened to a rock, was left alone. Moreover, the opening into the new gallery was not 20 paces distant from the spot. Our little troop, with myself at the head, advanced. The orifice, which was almost circular, presented a diameter of about 5 feet. The somber tunnel was cut in the living rock and coated on the inside by the different material which had once passed through it in a state of fusion. The lower part was about level with the water, so that we were able to penetrate to the interior without difficulty. We followed an almost horizontal direction, when, at the end of about a dozen paces, our further advance was checked by the interposition of an enormous block of granite rock. "Accursed stone!" I cried furiously, on perceiving that we were stopped by what seemed an insurmountable obstacle. In vain we looked to the right, in vain we looked to the left, in vain examined it above and below. There existed no passage, no sign of any other tunnel. I experienced the most bitter and painful disappointment. So enraged was I that I would not admit the reality of any obstacle. Stooped to my knees, I looked under the mass of stone. No hole, no interstice. I then looked above. The same barrier of granite. Hans, with the lamp, examined the sides of the tunnel in every direction. But all in vain. It was necessary to renounce all hope of passing through. I had seated myself upon the ground. My uncle walked angrily and hopelessly up and down. He was evidently desperate. "But," I cried after some moments' thought, "what about Arne Saknussemm?" "You are right," replied my uncle. "He can never have been checked by a lump of rock." "No, 10,000 times no," I cried with extreme vivacity. This huge lump of rock, in consequence of some singular concussion or process, one of those magnetic phenomena which have so often shaken the terrestrial crust, has in some unexpected way closed up the passage. Many and many years have passed away since the return of Saknussemm and the fall of this huge block of granite. Is it not quite evident that this gallery was formerly the outlet for the pent-up lava in the interior of the earth, and that these eruptive matters then circulated freely. Look at these recent fissures in the granite roof. It is evidently formed of pieces of enormous stone, placed here as if by the hand of a giant who had worked to make a strong and substantial arch. One day, after an unusually strong shock, the vast rock which stands in our way, and which was doubtless the key of a kind of arch, fell through to a level with the soil and has barred our further progress. We are right, then, in thinking that this is an unexpected obstacle, with which Saknussemm did not meet, and if we do not upset it in some way, we are unworthy of following in the footsteps of the great discoverer, and incapable of finding our way to the center of the earth. In this wild way, I addressed my uncle. The zeal of the professor, his earnest longing for success, had become part and parcel of my being. I wholly forgot the past, I utterly despised the future. Nothing existed for me upon the surface of this sphere in the bosom of which I was engulfed. No towns, no country, no Hamburg, no Königstrasse, not even my poor Gretchen, who by this time would believe me utterly lost in the interior of the earth. "Well," cried my uncle, roused to enthusiasm by my words, "let us go to work with pickaxes, with crowbars, with anything that comes to hand but down with these terrible walls." "It is far too tough and too big to be destroyed by a pickaxe or crowbar," I replied. "What then?" "As I said, it is useless to think of overcoming such a difficulty by means of ordinary tools." "What then?" "What else but gunpowder, a subterranean mine? Let us blow up the obstacle that stands in our way." "Gunpowder?" "Yes, all we have to do is to get rid of this paltry obstacle." "To work, hands, to work," cried the professor. The Icelander went back to the raft and soon returned with a huge crowbar, with which he began to dig a hole in the rock, which was to serve as a mine. It was by no means a slight task. It was necessary for our purpose to make a cavity large enough to hold 50 pounds of fulminating gun cotton, the expansive power of which is 4 times as great as that of ordinary gunpowder. I had now roused myself to an almost miraculous state of excitement. While Hans was at work, I actively assisted my uncle to prepare a long wick made from damp gunpowder, the mass of which we finally enclosed in a bag of linen. "We are bound to go through," I cried enthusiastically. "We are bound to go through," responded the professor, tapping me on the back. At midnight, our work as miners was completely finished. The charge of fulminating cotton was thrust into the hollow, and the match, which we had made of considerable length, was ready. A spark was now sufficient to ignite this formidable engine and to blow the rock to atoms. We will now rest until tomorrow. It was absolutely necessary to resign myself to my fate and to consent to wait for the explosion for 6 weary hours.